Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're tackling something super interesting. It's all about how society views women's bodies.
Oh, yeah, it's a big one.
It is. Specifically, we're going to be looking at how certain actions and choices get judged, like through this moral lens. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally.
So, our main source material is this study. It's called The Moralization of Women's Bodies. Pretty straightforward title.
Right to the point.
Exactly. And by the end of this, you'll have like a whole new understanding of, what shapes how we see women's actions. And honestly, there are some really surprising findings. We're even going to talk about how, like, bodybuilding can be seen as morally wrong, depending on if it's a man or a woman doing it.
It's true. It's true. That's one of the things that really struck me about this research. It shows how even things that seem, neutral can be judged so differently based on gender.
Data on the screen, numbers come alive. Male, female flows where the patterns thrive. Visual charts, public colors unify. Gender decoded, bringing truth to light. Small drum fill. We break it down, real talk. Trends unveiling facts from every block. Here's your insight, watch the data glide. Gender decoded, let the beats collide.
Today, we're tackling something pretty fascinating and honestly kind of sensitive, too. It's all about how society seems to judge women's bodies through this lens of morality. Like there's this hidden rule book we're all playing by, but no one ever really talks about it.
Yeah, it's wild how these judgments can feel so normal, like they're just common sense or tradition, when really there's a lot more going on under the surface.
Right. And the study that's going to help us unpack all this is called The Moralization of Women's Bodies. Just the title already has me intrigued. So to kick things off, can you explain what moralization actually means in this context? Because it feels like it's more than just saying something is right or wrong.
You're totally on the right track. It's not just about labeling actions, but about connecting those actions to a person's value. Like when a behavior gets moralized, it comes with all these social consequences, judgments about your character. It's like pressure to conform.
So it's less about she did a bad thing and more like she is bad because of it.
Yeah, exactly. And this isn't some new phenomenon either. Historically, patriarchal systems have used moral judgments as a way to control women's bodies. For example, think about strict dress codes or limitations on reproductive rights.
Wow, that's a really good point. It's like using morality as a way to control, which is honestly kind of meta when you think about it. So how does this study actually dig into all of this?
Well, they use something called moral foundation theory as a framework. It basically says our moral judgments are shaped by these 5 core foundations: harm, purity, fairness, authority, and loyalty.
Okay, I think I'm following. So like stealing from someone would violate the Fairness Foundation, right?
Exactly. And here's where things get interesting. The study points out how purity is applied way differently to men and women. Often behaviors that might seem like they violate purity norms are judged much more harshly if it's a woman involved.
I could see that. It's like this unspoken expectation of purity that women are held to almost like a measuring stick for how good or bad they are.
And that's a key piece of how the moralization of women's bodies plays out. So to test this, they had 335 people rate different behaviors on a scale of how much of a moral issue they considered them to be.
Got it. So they were looking at people's gut reactions to different actions. Were these just random actions, or was there a method to the madness?
It was very strategic. They compared body-related behaviors to more neutral control behaviors.
So like what kinds of body-related behaviors are we talking about here? I'm guessing things that are generally seen as more taboo or controversial.
They covered a good range, things like being topless in public, choosing to get sterilized, the number of sexual partners someone has, even bodybuilding. And then for the control group, it was more everyday stuff, like watching too much TV or playing chess, just to have a point of comparison.
Okay, I see where they're going with this. They wanted to see if there was a difference in how men and women were judged for basically doing the same thing.
Exactly. And the results are honestly pretty shocking.
Ooh, okay, now I really want to hear more. What did they find?
Well, what they found was this pretty consistent pattern. Women's actions were judged more harshly than men's, even when the behavior was basically the same. It was like this underlying double standard.
Okay, I need the details. What were some of the specific behaviors that stood out?
So let's start with something simple: toplessness. The study found that a woman being topless in public was viewed as a much bigger moral issue than a man doing the same thing.
You know, it's funny because we just accept that as normal, but when you really think about it, it shows how deep these double standards run. Like, no one even questions why it's okay for a man to be shirtless, but not a woman.
Exactly. It really reflects this deep-seated idea that female toplessness is somehow indecent, while male toplessness is just, well, normal.
It's like women's bodies are just automatically seen as more sexual, no matter what the context.
That's a great point, and it connects to another finding that really jumped out at me. The study looked at voluntary sterilization, and you'd think that would be a purely personal choice, right? But women choosing to get sterilized were judged way more harshly than men who made the same choice.
Wow, that's just wrong. It's like their reproductive choices are held to this totally different moral standard. Why do you think that is?
I think it goes back to those cultural anxieties we were talking about earlier, especially around women having autonomy and control over their bodies. Historically, women's reproductive abilities have been seen as something to be controlled, not something they get to decide for themselves.
It's like there's this fear of women having too much power over their own lives.
Exactly. And that control narrative pops up again in another interesting finding. The number of sexual partners someone had made a huge difference in how they were judged, but only for the women. Having multiple partners was seen as way more morally problematic for women than for men.
Oh, the classic double standards. Like, women are supposed to be both sexually desirable and completely pure, which, like, are those even possible at the same time?
It's tough, right? And it really highlights that whole Madonna whore dichotomy that we see so often in our culture. It's like women get forced into these narrow boxes, and any deviation from the pure ideal is met with judgment. But it wasn't all about sex. The study found similar patterns, even with things like working as a stripper.
Oh, yeah. I was wondering about that one. So was there a difference in how men and women were judged for that?
Definitely, while both genders were judged, women were seen as much more morally wrong for being involved in sex work. It all comes back to these preconceived notions about women's sexuality and what's acceptable behavior. Like we were saying before, it's about control and who gets to make the rules.
So it's not really about the action itself. It's about who's doing it and whether it fits into this tiny box that society has created for women.
Exactly. And you know what's crazy? Even something as simple as getting drunk was judged as more morally wrong for women than for men.
Seriously, I mean, people make mistakes, right? It just doesn't seem fair to hold women to a different standard for something like having a few too many drinks.
Yeah, it's not. And it kind of plays into that idea we talked about before, like women needing to be protected even from themselves. It's this paternalistic view that's often disguised as concern, but really it's about limiting women's freedom. But hey, remember when we talked about bodybuilding earlier? I have to admit that one surprised me. I mean, surely that can't be judged differently for men and women, right? It seems pretty neutral.
Yeah, that one threw me off too. What did the study say about that?
You'd be surprised, even something like bodybuilding, which seems pretty neutral, was subject to this gender bias. Women who were into bodybuilding were judged more harshly than men.
It's like women can't even exercise without someone making a moral judgment about it. Why is that?
I think it shows a discomfort with women displaying physical strength or power. It challenges the traditional ideas of femininity, and that can trigger all sorts of anxiety and judgment.
It's interesting because we talk so much about breaking down gender stereotypes. But then you see these findings, is like, are we really making any progress? It's like women can't win. If they're too passive, they're not assertive enough. If they're too strong, then they're not feminine enough. It's like walking a tightrope.
You're exactly right. And that's why understanding these patterns of moral judgment is so important. It's not about blaming anyone. It's about recognizing these biases and how they affect women's lives.
Yeah, so we've seen all these examples, and the pattern is pretty clear. Women are being judged differently, especially when it comes to their bodies. But why? What's at the root of all this? It's like we've uncovered this whole hidden layer of expectations and judgments that women are constantly dealing with. But how does this actually play out in real life? It can't just be these isolated examples, right?
You're so right. These biases show up everywhere. Think about the workplace. Have you ever noticed how a woman's appearance or like how assertive she is judged differently than a man's?
Oh, yeah, totally. It's like if a woman speaks her mind, she's aggressive. But if a guy does the same thing, he's confident or a leader.
Exactly. And think about how a woman's clothing choices are always under scrutiny, especially in professional settings. It all goes back to this idea that women's bodies have to follow different rules.
And it's not just at work either. It's in relationship too. I know I've felt pressure to fit certain beauty standards or been judged for my dating history in a way that my guy friends haven't.
That's a really good point. These judgments can really mess with your self-esteem and how you see yourself and your partners. It can even affect how comfortable you are expressing yourself sexually.
It's like these biases are this invisible force that's always limiting our choices, even when we don't realize it.
That's the thing about unconscious bias, but we can't forget about the role of the media in all of this. Think about how often women's bodies are objectified or judged in movies and TV shows and ads. It just keeps reinforcing these narrow and often harmful ideas about what's acceptable for women.
It's this constant stream of messages saying women need to look and act a certain way or else.
And those consequences are real. These moral judgments have a huge impact. They affect things like hiring decisions, access to healthcare, even legal cases. It's not just an idea, it's about power and who has it.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation, but I have to ask, where do we go from here? How do we challenge these biases that are so deeply ingrained? It all feels kind of overwhelming.
It's a big challenge, for sure, but awareness is the first step. Recognizing that these judgments exist, understanding where they come from, and seeing how they show up in our lives is so important. It's like finally shining a light on something that's been hiding in the dark for way too long.
And once we see it, we can start to question it, right? We can challenge those norms.
Exactly. Education is huge, too. We need to have open and honest conversations about gender and sexuality and how moralizing women's bodies affects everyone. That's how we start breaking down stereotypes and making things more equitable.
We've talked about so much today, from the history to the psychology of all of this, but I think what really sticks with me is how deeply these biases affect women. It's not just about feelings, it's about real consequences and missed opportunities.
I agree. And I hope that our listener feels empowered to start noticing these patterns and challenging them wherever they see them, whether it's at work or in their relationships or even in the media we consume. We all have a part to play in changing these harmful norms.
So to everyone listening out there, keep questioning, keep observing, and keep pushing for a world where women's bodies are celebrated, not controlled. A world that values their strengths, diversity, and autonomy.
It's time for a new rule book, don't you think?
Totally agree. And on that note of empowerment, we'll wrap things up here. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and until next time, keep digging.